Well, we want to welcome everyone to another evening of Stump the Stars, Jewish style. Grateful for those of you who are here in the room with us, who are here in the computer with us, and for those who may join us and view this recording later. We want to follow our usual practice, which is we give preference to those who are actually here. So if either of you have any questions, we would start with those.
Or there's more than either. There's any.
Well, I ran into a verse after a long while. It was in, I want to say Timothy, either one or two, about a woman must be quiet in her learning. And I ran into that one in a long time, so I was just wondering what the context is behind that.
Okay, for all of you who did not hear, the question was out of the book, I think it's First Timothy, where it's a woman can learn in quietness. It's those verses. And Mr. Bible Guy is looking it up as we speak.
Okay, it's First Timothy 2,
First Timothy 2.
beginning at verse 11 and running to verse 15.
Okay. Do you have an answer?
Oh,
You might more likely have a set answer than I do.
well,
I only have thoughts.
share your thoughts as well as the authors that you found helpful on this.
Oh dear. And I wish I would have studied them recently. It was First Timothy what?
First Timothy 2, 11 to 15.
Yeah, I was already down First Timothy. I didn't see it. All right. This is interesting. First of all, kings and all that, so that we may lead it. I don't have the women thing here. We need in First Timothy 2.
11, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. This new Bible. Sorry, new Bible. A woman who should learn in silence with full submission. I do not allow a woman to teach or have authority over a man, and said she is to be silent. Well, my initial response is, if you only read the set of verses there, you will be incompletely informed, because there's a very famous section where it says when women pray and prophesy in public, they're to have their heads covered. So if they're remaining silent and listening, how on earth can they pray and prophesy in public? So that would be your first confounding variable into taking this word for word. This is the God's honest truth about that. That's probably not how you would have begun it, but that's my initial response.
No, that's a perfect initial response. That's 1 Corinthians 11.
Sounds right.
Go ahead.
Well, I have nothing. That was my initial response to it.
Do you want to share the names of some of the books that you've?
Yeah, if I can remember them. So because I have not reviewed the content of women, because this has always been, John has been much better than I am about it, because he's the new covenant guy, and I know more about first covenant, which also has things to say about women, but we won't get into that, because of the two sets of verses, the people who are still against women being on the dais, or even some, we know personally some who really feel uncomfortable when women read from the Torah scroll, and they've said that publicly. Mm-hmm. We know people who feel uncomfortable if a woman wears a talit. That would be more those who are Orthodox Jewish insensibility. That is one of the walls that's beginning to crumble, along with a kippah, or a head covering, rather than having what we would have called in the 60s a shmati. A shmati is one of those drapey, scarvy things, and a shmati in Yiddish is a rag. Head coverings is another topic. The first time I ever read in an organized manner a woman who took each of the Bible passages in the Newer Covenant that said that basically that women must be submissive according to a certain criteria of this is what is submissive, but this is what is not submissive, was, and I can't think of her name,
Do you remember the name of the book?
Women Be Free.
That's what I was thinking.
And it was written in the late 1960s. This is how far back. And her husband, it was a wonderfully short, very well written book.
Gundry.
Gundry. Patricia Gundry, Gundry. Very short, very short. It's not a theologically based extravaganza. It is for average, ordinary lay people to sit down and read, in their quiet times. And she goes through each of the passages, including many in the Older Testament also, but the ones in the Newer Testament are more problematic. Her husband lost his job at Moody Bible Institute, Moody Press, because she wrote that book. Her husband lost his job because she wrote that book. And there are several books that she's written, and she wrote them in the early 1970s, into the 80s. And as I said, very clear writer. She's not impressed with, long theological treatises about anything. She just takes things at face value and sort of, to me, remember, I had small children at that point in time, and I wasn't seeing anybody in the public at that point because I was home with kids mainly. And I wasn't getting any negative feedback, but I just was impressed with the way she handled everything. Another book that I would recommend from her before I forget is Mutual Submission, which is her take on marriage. And that's, at that point in history, it was pretty gutsy for a woman to say, the submission is mutual. However, that is the way it's expressed in the Greek. That in a marriage, you submit to each other. It's not the woman submits and the guy lords it over, almost literally. That is not the way the scriptures teach. However, it's very popular to believe that nowadays. Is that what you thought I could contribute?
But would you also reflect briefly on the key women in the Older Testament?
Well, whenever I teach prophecy, which I have to do because I teach a course in minor prophecy and I teach a course in major prophecy, I always remind my classes, which are mainly men, that there were women prophets. They're called prophetesses, which I think that's a dated type of word that's going to go the way of all flesh pretty soon, where if you're a prophet, you're a prophet. It doesn't need to be gender oriented. So you obviously had Deborah, who was not just a prophet, she was also a judge. And I've asked all my classes for many years, have you ever heard anyone give a sermon on Deborah? And I have gotten no response to anyone ever having heard a sermon on Deborah, much less know what she was and what she stood for. Isaiah's wife was a prophet. I mean, there are several kinds of groups of people, and I don't have those notes with me, but trust me, in the Tanakh, there were a bunch that are identified as prophets.
Okay, as you were talking, you stirred up in my mind several things. A quick note on Deborah. Well, first of all, let's back up to 1 Timothy 2.
Yeah, this is only tangential for 1 Timothy.
But the author of 1 Timothy 2, of course, is Rav Shammua. He and his, I was going to say readers, in this case reader, because this was addressed to his student, Timothy, knew full well all these women who were part of the history of Israel that are recorded in the Older Testament. So what he's saying here needs to be read against the broader context of Jewish history, in this case, going back into the Older Testament period, of which Deborah is just one of the key figures. From time to time, we sing a song as part of our liturgy, Mika Mocha. That too was called Miriam's song. So she can
Miriam was another prophet.
Yeah. If the tradition is correct outside the actual biblical texts, and had there been no Miriam, there never would have been a Moses, because it was her actions that saved his life.
The way you put that.
You like that? I was stealing it from if there hadn't been a Hanukkah. Okay. Now let's look at Deborah. I have heard on more than one occasion said, oh, the reason she was the leader of Israel, and in that case, please remember, this was before the kings, so the chief leader of Israel at that time was called a judge. So,
Or there could have been more than one judge
yes.
in various parts of the country, but
So she's the leader, and I have heard it said, oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say in her part.
In
You
her
don't know
part,
it.
yes, how large that part was. So I've heard it said, well, that's because there was nobody else that God could have chosen at that time.
That God was not happy with Barak, her military commander.
Or any other men of that time.
No. So that's the reason why she had to step up, because there was nobody else.
Yeah, because
So it's the default.
so it's the default exception. All right, here's the issue with that default exception. If you read the text about Barak, he was anything but non-heroic. He was clearly presented as a great general and as a hero. And in fact, she recognized it and wanted to turn the leadership over to Barak. And Barak said, no, you are God's chosen for now.
If you don't go with me, I'm not going into battle. And once again, that can be spun as saying, well, he was too chicken to go by himself. Well, look what a weenie he was. Or you could spin it a different way, saying, look how much he was basically anointed by God for this position during his lifetime. And he said that she was the important one in the relationship. By the way, the last part of the Deborah story also has to do with a heroic woman who caused the complete defeat of the enemy. Her name was Yael. That's a very popular name today in Israel, Yael. And it's about the woman who invited the enemy general to come into her tent, and she was going to make him some nice warm milk so he could get some rest. And while he was sleeping, she...
He lost his head.
No, she beat his brains in.
Okay.
And once again, I guess, the negative spin is, well, the men were so wimpy. Well, they won the whole battle. I don't know how you can say that wasn't a good job for the Jewish nation, but spin is a powerful, powerful thing.
Continuing on the idea that Deborah was not an exception, she ruled as judge for 40 years. So then you are trying to, I'm saying you in general, those who say that this was an exception. So you are saying then that for 40 years, God could not find
Any man.
someone better, any man. And the longest period anybody was ever judge in Israel was 40 years. So Patrice's mention of prophetesses reminded me of one who has a gate named after her in Jerusalem. Huldah.
She's very famous. You look in the book of Jeremiah, when the King Josiah, who ruled in the 600s BCE, while his workmen were cleaning up the temple, they found what was called a book of the law. If you have been reading the backstory of Josiah, which I realize not many of you have been doing lately, the backstory is that the king right before Josiah was Manasseh. And Manasseh was the most evil king in the history, possibly of both the north and the south. He was just horribly evil. The rabbis say that Manasseh killed Isaiah by torturing him to death. He was old at that point, but still. And so when Josiah came to power as a younger man after Manasseh died, and he ruled a long time, that he decided the first thing he needed to do was to clean up the temple, because the temple had been used for pagan idol worship and for prostitution in service of pagan gods. And there were dormitories built for all the women that were there to service all the people who wanted to worship pagan idols. They were breaking down some of these built on rooms, and that's when they found a book of the law, which evidently had been hidden from Manasseh in the temple at that point. And when Josiah read it, and scholars today think he rediscovered the book of Deuteronomy. And when he discovered that, he said, this is very, very important if it's the real deal. And so he said, I must send this to an expert on our scriptures. So I'm going to send it to Huldah. And there was no hesitation. And she was the one that was her field, was, I guess, textual criticism, to see authentication of whether or not this was a real part of the Bible that had been mislaid, or the real part of a scroll that had been mislaid. And they sent it to her. She said, yes, this is something that we should be following it as part of our scriptures. And Josiah then proceeded to do a lot of reform in the nation because of Huldah's expertise and their reliance on her. So she's not named as a prophet, but she would be named as the royal smart person, I guess. That's from a Muppets book I used to read the kids, where the Muppets go, send for the royal smart person. And I always, when I was reading them, I think I would really like to be the royal. That would be a great job. Every now and then I have moments of it. So anyway, go ahead.
Okay. So that's another important.
That's the story of Huldah.
Huldah. That's another important person that obviously was important in Jewish history, because she had a gate to the temple area named after her. So she would have been well known both to Timothy and to Ram Shaul.
And if you go to see, there's a miniature version of Jerusalem in the year 30 AD.
Yeah, well,
It's about knee high, and it spreads, I would say, about half of a room, and you can, if they'd let you, you could walk among these buildings. But the cool thing is, they actually acknowledge Huldah's, and they go, this is where Huldah's home would have been, and they show it where they presume it was. So that also is pretty cool.
yeah. So another important character and recognizable and well-known character from Israeli history that both the author and the receiver of this particular letter would have been familiar with. Speaking of the author of the letter, one of his colleagues, and he mentions her in Romans chapter 16, is a woman by the name of Junia. And Junia, he there calls an apostle. Now, that's a significant title, significant role, significant responsibility. So he would not have said anything that would have undercut her authority or her role either. He mentions other women who are colleagues and who've worked with him, including Phoebe, and there's every indication that Phoebe is the one who's entrusted with communicating one of the letters, and I think it's Philippians, but I'm not certain if that's the one, to the congregations in that area. Now, just so you don't misunderstand this was reinforced to me, I think just last week. The people who delivered the letters were not just mail carriers, so to speak. These were the people who actually represented the author and read the letter to those who were the recipients. In other words, this is a person who stood in the place of the author, and he chooses Phoebe, in this particular case, to be the one who does exactly that. In order to read the letter appropriately, Um, I wonder if I wrote something on the board. Well, you can visualize this, so I won't put it on the board. Uh, the Greek letters, and I'm using that term in both senses now, of those days, uh, were what we would call run on, in the sense that there were no breaks between words. So you just had a stream of letters,
There's no punctuation.
no punctuation. That means you had to know what the text said in order to read it effectively. You had to be a master of the text, and you also had to be, because you could have broken it up in several different ways, you also needed to know to be, yeah, let me just leave that. You needed to be a master of the text in order to read it. So that's a person of how should I put it? You would only give that to a person who was highly educated and very familiar and to be trusted with communicating the message, not just as if I got this note and I'm going to read it. I have found that, and I'm going to finish this later because this is a question. So do you follow that? So yet another person, and Phoebe's mentioned by name also in Romans, as well as I think in Philippians 4. So women, both in Israel's history and contemporary women with whom the author would have worked. There's another one whom we work very closely with, found in the book of Acts. It's the husband-wife team. Usually we refer to the husband and wife team as Priscilla and Aquila, not because we're being good gentlemen and it's ladies first, but because that's how in all but one case she appears. That means she's given the prominence in this husband-wife team, so it was a wife-husband team. All that, and these are co-workers of Rav Shaul. So all of that has to inform what he's saying here, which then raises the question, so then what is he saying here? Well, there's a book that addresses just this. I think it's called Suffer Not a Woman.
Yeah,
Something like that.
something like that.
And I'm thinking it was written by a husband-wife team.
You're
Okay.
looking at me like I know.
Well, you know the book. I just don't remember if you remember it.
And I remember.
I think her name is Alvira
Oh, yeah, Mickelson. Yeah.
and she and her husband wrote the book. It directly treats just this text, not some of the related texts. Another excellent treatment of this text and the broader field as well is a friend of ours whose father was a major scholar of the Older Testament. Our friend's name is Philip Payne, Payne, and he wrote a book called,
Men,
is it Male and Female or Men and
I
Women?
think it's men.
Men and Women United in Christ, or maybe it's United in Christ, Men and Women, whichever way it is. And when that came out, I said, thanks, Phil, for doing that.
That's only about this thick.
That's what I was going to say. It's 500 plus pages, and he said it's the condensation of his research on the field. So,
Okay, I have a couple other things here
okay,
when you're done.
all right. I think I'm almost done. Oh, and I'm crossing these things off as they came to mind as you were talking.
Mhm.
So what does the term actually mean here? This is the term that's used here in this text is found once and only once in the entire New Testament, which means it's not found in the Older Testament. Why? Because this is written in Greek. The Older Testament's written in Hebrew. That was a trick question.
Quick question.
So we're not totally sure what the meaning of that word is exactly, and it appears to have the idea, given Brett's background in classical or Koine Greek, of usurp authority. In other words, that brings us into one further context, and with this I'm done, and that is the context in Ephesus, which is where this was taking place. And apparently there was in Ephesus, and we know this historically, groups of women who I want to use this term very carefully, who dominated men.
That doesn't sound good the way.
No,
you
I know.
said
That's why I was sort of fumbling for a better term. in that particular religious group or sect in Ephesus, it was the women who were in charge of everything. The men were subservient. Um, and it appears that perhaps there were some from that particular group who came over to the Messianic group and so assumed that they would be the ones who were automatically in charge, and so they usurped authority. In other words, they took an authority that was not theirs. The authority of leadership within a congregation was something that was done, was not imposed on the congregation, but was set up by the founders of the congregation and those who became leaders within it. And so these were apparently women who came from the outside and tried to seize authority that was not theirs. And so he was responding to that particular situation. You get more of that one in both Suffer Not a Woman and the Mickelson book and the Payne book. So it's addressing a specific situation in Ephesus. And then I want to get right back to where Patrice started in 1 Corinthians 11.
No. Oh, go ahead. No. All right. I didn't know you were.
Yes, I'm going to get right back there and remind you what she said there. There the women are given instructions as to how they are to lead in prayer and to prophesy. Just so you don't miss the term prophesy in that context, prophesy was an equivalent term to preach. In other words, they took the role of rabbi or pastor or preacher, whatever term, and they're given instructions as to how they could do that, written by the same person who wrote this. So you've got to read the one in the larger context that we've been talking about. Yes.
And I'm going back to Romans 16, where Phoebe appears. It says, this is a version, which evidently this Apologetic Study Bible, which is printed by Holman Publishing, and they're very, very conservative Baptist, straight arrows. Okay, so this is not wild and wacky. This is how they translate it. I commend you to our sister Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in, is it Kenkrea? Greek named church. So you should welcome her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints and assist her in whatever matter she may require your help. For indeed, she has been a benefactor of many and of me also. This term benefactor, I think probably is, although I don't have the Greek right here, that term benefactor is something that women were. They were benefactors. In other words, they were involved in congregation planting throughout the diaspora. And if there were rich widows, especially, they would give money for people to establish congregations, synagogues in that time, Messianic synagogues, particularly in that time that Rav Shaul is talking about. So Phoebe is wealthy and she's a leader because he acknowledges her. And this also reminds, if you look down a little further in 16 verse 7, it says, greet Andronicus and Junia. So they do have Junia here in the super straight
Cool.
Baptist Bible. And then you read in the margin, the footnote for it, many claim that Junia, because you have to change it to Junius. If you think this has to be a man, then you have to change his name as reflected in the Greek. I don't know about you. I'm not in favor of changing the Greek thing. So, if your only background is it can't possibly be a woman he's talking to here, because he gives her a lot of credit. Many claim that Junia, designating one of Paul's relatives, could be either a man's or a woman's name. Well, that they don't have things like people named Madison. Anybody who's been aware in the year 2022 realize that Madison is a girl's name, even though if you were born in 1922, you would assume it was a man's.
A very famous picture of today.
Madison Baumgartner.
Exactly.
Jewish, by the way. But anyway, that's beyond the point here. I'm just saying to switch around these genders of these names because you're concerned about they couldn't possibly be a woman. in the masculine form, junius, has not been located elsewhere, where the feminine junia is a common name back in those times. Of course, if this person was a woman, this would be an intriguing fact. I'm not going to continue reading a footnote because it's not that edifying. But there is a very, very, very good short book, once again, called Junia is Not Alone. Junia is Not Alone. And it was written by Scott McKnight, except this Scott has only one T, and McKnight, McKnight. He's a seminary professor out in California, and he writes especially about all the dialoguing and all of the ideas behind whether this is a man or a woman's name. And it's very exciting. It's a very short book. It's very exciting because he writes well and he tries to bring the human element into, sifting out the evidence about whether it's a man or a woman. So I highly recommend that. 2, I like to recommend short books because there's more of a chance you're going to be able to read it.
Okay, I was trying to.
Anything more from you? Those who are.
No, I was just trying to find Phoebe, look her up elsewhere, but it was not successful. So, you might ask the question, and I see Scott's hand. You might ask the question, but wait a second. In Judaism, weren't women in how we say?
Second class citizens?
Second class, that's what I was looking for, second class citizens. My response to that would be a book written by a Catholic nun. Her name is Bernadette Bruton, Brooten, Women Leaders in Ancient Synagogues. And what she did is she didn't discuss the biblical text at all. She just looked at the historical records and the archaeological artifacts, and she spells this out in her book. She points out that there were women who were named who were called arche synagogae, head of the synagogue. Now it's a little tough to argue with a rock, because you don't have. We'll just leave it at that. I have all kinds of tangents to go on that I better not. Now people have said, "Oh well, that was just a title of honor that was given to the wife of who's actually the head of the synagogue." But the rock says it's the wife who's the head of the synagogue, and that's just one example of many.
She trots out a lot of different examples from archaeology.
Okay, but I thought we should at least address that issue of women as second-class citizens of Judaism or of synagogues.
And go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say this about that. It is true that even nowadays, the ultra-Orthodox, the Hasidim, the ones that have curly side locks and funny hats, who and if you live in Israel, they won't even speak Hebrew because it's too holy of a language for common everyday people to speak. So they speak Yiddish. In those cultures, they have ways of keeping women where they want them, but all the time they praise them up one side and down the other. And that, I think, has been the way it has been. I mean, we all right, you can imagine that in their heart of hearts, these Jewish men are saying, well, we have to keep control of these women because they will get out of control because they're way too emotional for their own good. I bet some women have heard this kind of thought. And you still find it. However, that does not mean to say that these women are not honored. They are honored, especially if you're a mother. If you're not a mother, that becomes more difficult for you. But I would rather that it be honest and open and above board, and that people, if they feel that they have to placate women so that they don't get all huffy and try to take control, that's the issue that is talked about in the scripture, where women usurp the leadership. And that is what is spoken against, that in all cases, there shouldn't be women who usurp their leadership. In other words, they come up, I don't know how they do it. They come up and they tell the men to sit down and they start blabbering, in front of the congregation. But that women's leadership is honored and recognized so that there's no usurping going on. Because there are some women, it's obvious today, that are leaders. And as I said, there are still congregations, Messianic congregations, where women are not barely allowed to read scripture in public. They're allowed to teach children and they're allowed to cook in the kitchen, but they're not allowed to make decisions. They are not allowed on any deacon or elder boards. That's a normal thing. Our congregation is very unusual in that we've always had women on the leading board of, I don't know, the boss guys. But that has not been so in the vast majority of congregations in the Messianic movement.
Okay,
Didn't he have
Yes,
a waving hand?
that's my okay. Scott,
I just wanted to mention, you mentioned Scott Knight as an author,
Mhm.
and I just finished his book, Reading Romans Backwards. And
Oh,
the
did you
book,
like it?
I loved it. It begins right with Phoebe and all the responsibility that Rav Shaul put into her to get the letter of Romans. He said it's the letter of Romans that he took to Rome and went to all the synagogues, and she was trained intensively by Rav Shaul himself to make sure that this came across properly to all the congregations, and he put all this trust in Phoebe. It's just a wonderful book, and Mark Nanos too, Mystery of Romans, great book and they talk about Phoebe in that as well.
Okay,
Good stuff.
super.
thank you.
That's
So it was
wonderful.
Romans, not Philippians.
That's what I read.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
All right. Then any questions from those of you who are with us and are on our monitor?
Thanks for that question.
Yes, excellent question. And we could obviously spend a lot more time.
It would have been better had we studied up on it. But it's okay. It's all right. I think we got you an answer a little bit.
Yeah, off the top.
We got you a place to start with an answer, and that's usually all we can give you.
All right, then we do have two questions that were sent in already prior to our last Stump the Stars we did not get to. So I'm going to take these in chronological order. And unfortunately, the person who sent this particular one in is often with us, but he's not with us right now. So maybe he'll catch this afterwards. I will read it and then we'll attack it. He says,
Dear STS, Stump the Stars. That's very
Like that?
funny. That's very funny. Good question.
two interrelated questions. Question one, I've found that Christian baptism has its roots in the ancient Jewish mikveh temple ritual. But where does the mikveh ritual roots come from? Is it in the Torah?
I don't know the answer to this. I mean, I have a feeling about the answer.
Go ahead.
Well, no, if you know, then
All right. The answer to that, I'm going to answer in typical rabbinic fashion. Is it in the Torah? Yes.
yes.
And
and
no.
no.
Okay. What has come to be known as baptism, or it's in Hebrew, it's tevilah, not to be confused with tefillah. Tefillah is prayer. Tefillah is,
Two different Hebrew roots.
yes. Tevilah has to do with the process of immersion. So if you want to put it crudely, tefillah is prayers, that goes up. Tevilah is immersion, that goes down. Just came to me. Those kinds of things happen. So, do you find that in the Older Testament? Yes and no. The process itself, known as tevilah, is not found in the Older Testament as such, but it draws from something that's found in the Older Testament. Okay, trivia question. Was water important either at the tabernacle, the Mishkan, or at the temple during the Older Testament times? Jessica's nodding her head yes, Scott and Carol are nodding their heads yes. All right, where?
Where is it important?
Mhm.
Ask them.
Where?
For washing the hands, whatever.
The laver.
The laver.
The laver.
Exactly. The laver.
11 gallons. I happened to read that the other day. 11 gallons of water were in the laver. So that's quite a lot of water.
Well, that's a lot bigger than I usually
Yeah.
picture it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the process, as Jessica mentioned, it is the washing of the hands at the laver. What did that involve? That involved was it just the hands that were washed? I think it was just the hands that were washed.
Not the face too.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. But anyhow, that's because before you could be involved in temple procedure, you had to, as the, is it the psalmist who says, he who has clean hands and a pure
Pure
heart?
heart. Well, you would know that's part of the Passover
Yes, yeah.
readings.
But anyhow, it was a visual symbol for coming to God with all things taken care of. You know, you've cleaned up your act, that kind of thing. Now, from there became associated different kinds of washings, also for the process of purification. The laver hand washing, by the way, has come down to us in Jewish tradition as the washing of the hands before we eat a meal. It's the same idea that's in place there. There was, in addition to the laver, there was I think it's in the book of Leviticus, there was the ritual purification of a woman.
Well, I was going to bring that up if you
Go.
did not bring that up before.
Didn't go for it.
So after her monthlies, women had to go and not just take a bath, but take a special bath in clean water, water that was called living water, which was a technical term for a type of water. The water could not come from a mud puddle. That's not living water. Living water is water that has been moving. Water that's from a freshwater source, that is not a mud puddle or a bathtub with a plug in it that's been left out in the rain. None of that is living water. And so even if the vast majority of the water, which would be, almost like a very deep bathtub, so that the mikvahot that we have in Israel today from Second Temple times is you literally walk down into the water and the water was deep. It was a deep and very square area, and then you like dunked yourself. It wasn't like get a bar of ivory soap and scrub everything. That's not what they're talking about. It's this, is it a ritual? Yeah, it's a ritual, but in the sense of it cleans a woman. Remember, having blood around outside of a body, outside of a living body, is very nerve-wracking within Judaism. It's seen as very, I don't know if harmful is the right word, dangerous. It's blood being on your sheets or blood being on your clothes or blood being on the couch, even if it's all dried up, is seen even back then in Judaism as, yeah, this is bad and you've got to get rid of this because it's unclean in a very, very bad way. And those of us in Western society, we just laughed at that kind of stuff because, we are modern people and we don't see blood like that until AIDS. And then all of a sudden, human body fluids, they're horrible. They have to be, we can't have them out and touching people, which is what the Bible had said all along. When you have human liquids coming out of a human body of various kinds and various disgusting natures, you have to be careful with that. You just don't want people touching all those things because they can spread disease. And what did we discover in the 20th century? Because we're so smart. By golly, they were right. And they were especially right if it was still juicy. But once again, this had been laughed at down through the centuries as being, oh, they're so superstitious. It doesn't matter if I touch your blood. Nothing could possibly happen, except it does. And so that's why they used to spin these stories about, well, they were so superstitious that women wouldn't even sit on the same couch as other people when they were having their period. Well, that's so superstitious. Except they were just trying to not be in an awkward position where people unknowingly would sit in someone else's body fluids. And that can apply for men too, because men have body fluids, and sometimes body fluids get all over the bed for no apparent reason. And that's also not cool too. So let's not just be blaming women, because we knew some people, and the guys were blaming women because they were icky and had blood. Men have icky stuff too. And it's just as icky as blood. Just because it doesn't look like blood doesn't mean it's not icky. Everyone who's been married can acknowledge what I'm saying. Correct? Yes, I am correct. We all need to be careful. Everybody needs to be careful about their body fluids and who touches them. How did I get into that? Therefore, the women are instructed to go and watch every month after their periods are done. Imagine there are whole civilizations where there were no baths taken by anyone. Nobody took a bath. Nobody needed to. Why do you need to do that? It's silly. Sometimes when you watch a Western movie, they will, some people go, why are you taking a bath? It's unhealthy. You're going to catch your death of cold and die. And those of us who live in modern times go, imagine if nobody in your family ever took a bath. And there were no bodies of water that you could swim in. So there was no swimming either. Imagine the disease possibilities. Just imagine the disease possibilities of people who never even touched water because it was unhealthy. And I think that's part of this idea of the water cleanses people in some way and changes them and makes them acceptable. I'm not going to say holy, but makes them acceptable because of dirt and crud and body fluids corrupt what they're on, and therefore they must be washed. So they're suitable. They're suitable to serve God again. Was that clear? And I think that does come into baptism. I think that imagery, although men might not automatically identify with it, I think they should, because men have those fluids too.
And you can see how that's in keeping with the use of the laver in the tabernacle and temple as well. Now, so that was what was mentioned in, I think we decided it was Leviticus.
Yeah.
All right. That was expanded, especially when in some sense coupled with the understanding of the laver and its usage there. During temple times. Now, I don't know if it goes all the way back to first temple times, but certainly by second temple times, before you could go into the temple courtyard area, you had to go through the place where the water was contained is called the mikveh. The process is not called the mikveh. The process is called tevilah. The place where tevilah occurs is the mikveh. So there were these places, these mikvaot, where the women could do what they needed to do, but then this had been expanded as well to men, that there were certain situations where men needed to go through the mikveh as well. So with all that in place, it became very easy then to associate this with whenever you entered into the temple. So certainly by the second temple period, if you were going to go into the temple, before you could go into the temple, you had to go through the mikveh. And we know this was a very prominent practice because in the area of the temple in Jerusalem right now, and in the outside the temple walls and surrounding, in that area surrounding it. My recollection now is they've discovered something like 98 mikvaot.
Yeah, something right in there.
Something right in there. Okay, so to go into the temple, you gotta go through the mikvah first. That gets you set to be properly prepared to be in the temple. Okay, that process was in place. Now there was, and I'm trying to think of how to tie this in for you. All the way down through Jewish history, and this goes back to the time of the Exodus. It actually goes back to the time of Abraham, because Abraham is credited with turning a lot of people to a faith in the God of Abraham at that time. So there were those from the outside who became part of the family of God in that sense. But certainly from the time of the Exodus on, remember, it wasn't, and I mentioned this last night, it wasn't just the Israelis who left Egypt. There were some Egyptians who came with them, who then became attached to the Jewish community. And down through the years, they've always been people who've attached themselves to the Jewish or the Israeli community. The processes are not spelled out in detail at all in the Older Testament, in the Tanakh, but we've come to learn what that process came to be. We don't know quite how early it started. The process involved the person who was now going to formally connect to the Jewish community through the process of what we now call proselytizing or proselytism or conversion, whichever term works best for you. As part of the process, you needed to go through the mikveh, because that carried with it the idea, the same idea as doing a purification process. You went into it impure, you came out pure. You went into the mikveh as a Gentile, you come out of it as a Jew. There's been a transformation that's taken place, and the water and the cleansing the picture of cleansing that water provides helped reinforce that whole idea. So by the time of the Second Temple period, this process was already in place, the use of the mikveh. And in fact, we know that was in place because, unsurprisingly, there was a debate over where in the process of conversion the mikveh was supposed to take place. Was it the last thing that was done, or was it the next to last thing that was done, after which you then offered a sacrifice? And needless to say, the house of Shammai, or the school of Shammai, and the school of Hillel debated back and forth. And as so frequently the case, the school of Shammai won, or prevailed in the case. So the last part of the process of conversion then was this process of going through the mikveh. In the Second Temple period, building on that, there were a group of people who had grown up shortly after, or perhaps in conjunction with, the Maccabean revolt, and that which produced Hanukkah. Hanukkah and those who were responsible for it were not just the Maccabees. There were those who were called the Hasidim, not to be confused with the Hasidim that Patrice mentioned earlier. This is a historical group that is not connected, although their emphasis was quite similar. From the Hasidim grew the Pharisees and the Essenes. The Essenes were those who populated the community known as Qumran, the Dead Sea Scroll community. If you were going to be part of that Dead Sea Scroll community, if you were going to be part of the Essenes, even if you were a Jew, you had to go through the mikveh to identify with this particular group of Jews. So, and the mikveh was also very important as part of the daily process of purification at this place called Qumran. And you know that because there are a whole bunch of mikvaot that you can actually still see to this day, or the remnants of which you can still see today as you go through Qumran. And we've seen them.
Mm-hmm. And they had to go through it before they were going to sit down and copy scrolls.
I think they had to do it before they ate. They had to do it before you copied scrolls. But you had to do it when you first identified with the community, because now you were saying, before I was not part of that community, now I am part of this community.
Imagine you're in the desert. It gets less than 4 inches of rain a year by definition. That's the definition of a desert. And the Essenes were in the Judean desert. True, they could look across the street and see the Dead Sea, but remember, the Dead Sea is incredibly salty, 8 times more salty than any ocean. And so that was not usable water for bathing or for drinking, especially. So to have such a high priority on this continual washing of hands and your body in order to do the work on a daily basis, that's amazing. So you're asking, and how did they get the amount of water that they obviously needed, not only to wash themselves and do their ablutions,
Good terms.
Latin.
Crossword term.
I think it's, no, Latin. Where did they get it from? And the answer is the rain that would fall. So the vast majority of the 5 inches of rain would fall in 2 months. And they kept cisterns ready for the rainy season, which is approximately January and February. And they would then have tubs of it and barrels of it, and other ways to save the water that did come. So it's just, I think it's an interesting way of looking at how life was for the Essenes.
Okay. That sets the groundwork for question 2. John the Baptizer suddenly elevated the modest mikveh ritual at the temple to a huge public event at a river. So he's referencing the issue that took place at the temple.
Well, yes, sort of.
And I like this, like the Woodstock of baptisms. Was John
Yeah, it was
operating?
just like that.
Was John operating outside of the temple authority? What was happening here? Okay. Back to the Essenes. There's every likelihood that in some way, if not formally, informally, John was at one time or other in his life associated with the Essenes. So in effect, what he did is he took this thing that was already in place, and please remember the background. It was related to coming up to the temple. I'm not so sure how it would, well, all right, modest in another sense. I think I know what he means by modest here. Where it was an individual thing. He took that, as that was part of his background. You had the Essenes ritual as part of the background. You now became a specifically identified group within Judaism. And also part of the background was, before you were Jew, now you became a Jew, and the last step was the process of the mikvah. So he basically utilized what was already in place now to bring together a group of people who, like himself, because of his unique role in the Elijah role of announcing the coming of the Messiah, he used it as a way of helping people to see it was important to identify themselves as those who were there ready to welcome the Messiah at that time. So call them pre-messianics. So the Essenes had their own mikveh, or pardon me, their own tevilah that helped Jews identify as Essene Jews. John, undoubtedly having seen that, as well as seen the conversion tevilah, utilized that same process then to help those who were actively pre-messianic to identify as actively pre-messianic. So he was taking Jews and he was helping them identify as a specific group within Jews and within, yeah, we'll leave it as that, as within Jews. So there was something more I was going to say on that, but it slipped right past my mind. So anyhow, that was John's role. And it's interesting that Yeshua participated in that. Remember, John said when Yeshua came, listen, you don't need to prepare for this. You're it. And Yeshua said, no, I'm going to make this formal identification. I remember what I was going to say. Going through the mikveh then was like taking on a team uniform. You are saying, I'm now part of this team. Essenes, if you were Gentile Jews, or in John's case, you're identifying as what we've now called pre-Messianic. And then, of course, then Yeshua comes along, builds on the same thing, and now there becomes a mikveh, or not a mikveh, a tefillah that's related to those who are now actively followers of Yeshua. So they were not saying that they had converted. They were saying they were simply identifying themselves as a specific group within Judaism who have now actively not anticipated the Messiah, but accepted the Messiah. And so Yeshua says at the end of Matthew chapter 28, wherever you go, teach, but also baptize. In other words, make sure these people do formally identify and say, I'm now part of this community. And that's the role that it had originally, as it, I almost said, bled over into Christianity.
It's very inappropriate.
Inappropriate in view of our
Okay.
conversation.
Can I just say a little bit more
Please.
about that's revealed in the question? So it seems that the person who's asking this, he calls it the modest mikvah ritual at the temple to a huge public event. In the original way, that any temple does not come into this idea of cleansing yourself at all. It doesn't have to be approved by the temple. It doesn't have to be formulated by the temple. It doesn't have to have guards from the temple. This is what they knew to do from back in Leviticus. So I think I've got a good example here, where the mikvah would become the process of washing yourself would cleanse you from daily things that might render you to be unclean. And once again, unclean is a technical term in the scripture. It does not mean you're going to hell. That is not what unclean means. It also doesn't mean that you're going to get kicked out of the community. Once again, it's a technical description of something that is not at the norm, and the norm is appropriate for relationship with God. So one of the chapters that this comes up in is Leviticus 11. This is just one of many, many, many things. Okay, so in 11, starting in 24, it's talking about the problem where, and if you're basically a nation of farmers, you're going to find dead animals on your property, and you have to move them. You have to get rid of them. And touching a dead body of an animal for any Jewish person makes them unclean. In other words, something needs to be done. And as I said, it doesn't mean they get kicked out of the community. It does not mean that they go to hell. It has none of those meanings. It means that you would wash the clothes you had on. Well, first of all, you finished your job of getting rid of the dead animals. And then you were unclean for the rest of the evening. During that time period, you're not going to go give a sacrifice at either the tabernacle or the temple. You're going to wash your clothes or put on some clean clothes, and you're going to go through the mikveh. And when you come out of the mikveh, you're clean. And then the next day, after you've waited one day, you return to normal amounts of cleanliness. So it says, these dead animals will make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. See, everything is not ruined. And whoever carries any of their carcasses must wash their clothes and will be unclean until evening. And then what it doesn't say right here, but it says in other passages, you're going to go wash your clothes. You're going to put on clean clothes. First, you're going to have gone through the mikvah, and then your body will be clean. And when you wake up in the morning, you can just proceed as normal. Just proceed as normal. People have misconstrued this as to they can't even touch these animals, which is untrue. You can't touch the dead carcasses of these animals. You can't touch the dead bodies of people. you're going to have to do the evening in cleansing then. Is that the worst thing in the world you've ever heard of that someone would have to suffer through? No, it's part of life. It's part of life. Does that mean I could pet a pig, a live pig? Yes, you could. Do you pet live dogs? I do. They're sort of cool. Does that make me unclean? No, because they're alive.
And we actually pet a cat just
We have
recently.
grandkitties now. We not only have grandchildren, we have grandkitties. And do we pet the kitties? Yes, we do. We love the kitties.
We don't eat them.
We don't eat these kitties. And we don't touch them when they're dead unless we have to go and then take care of that deal. And I think the more you have this plan in your head as you're reading Leviticus, it becomes not such a big deal. It's just being very aware of what you're doing. And if necessary, then you're going to take the evening off, get your clothes clean and get your body clean, and then resume your previous activity the next morning. And I don't think that that's such a horrible burden of the law, because I see medical doctors following a much worse ritual just to go into an operating room with many more hours of preparation and worry and concern and carefulness. So this concept here was going on as a regular part of life in the Jewish community since, I would say, they followed Moses and Aaron into the wilderness, into the desert. And that's when these rules sort of would be established, and they would need to make sure that they had enough water. That answer is not given to us. Where did they get the water? We're not given that answer. When we finally get to heaven, they'll roll the videotapes and they'll show us how that all worked. But I think these are not heavy and weighty matters. It's like, if something happens and you need to deal with dead animals, or you need, you discover a dead body of a person, God forbid, but then you proceed to do that, and then the next day everything's back to normal. There are more serious breaking of this set of commandments, but then it tells you very clearly, what the payment is for that, or what the process is to make it right again. Is that helpful?
Yes, and in fact, as you were talking through that, I was scanning through the next several chapters of Leviticus. You were in 11, I stopped at 14, and even into 14, text was still talking about the whole cleansing process as it related not only to contact with dead things, but also as it related to skin diseases and the like. So this process of cleansing goes back a long time. It has to do both with the laver, as Jessica mentioned earlier, has to do with personal purification, and then eventually it became adapted, as I mentioned earlier, as part of the process by which a person from outside the community became attached to the community, whether it's a Jewish community or a sub-community within the Jewish community. And one other comment on becoming attached to the sub-community, in this case, the one associated with John and the pre-Messianics. The
Name of a rock group?
the process of tefillah with John was not a huge event.
No, it wasn't Woodstock.
It wasn't Woodstock. It was smaller groups of people, sometimes only individuals or a couple or three people at a time. Sometimes it was larger groups, but it was not something, it wasn't a huge gathering by
By the
River Jordan. And I say that because when we were the last time we were in Israel, almost 5 years ago, we did our usual stop at the Jordan, as we do before going up into Tiberias. And as we were there, either some group or some from outside of Israel or a church group from within Israel was gathered there for a baptismal. And there was a large group. That's what too often we envision with John. With John, no, it was just as people listened to his message, responded to his message, and connected with the message, they then decided to connect with him by going to the mikveh. Now, one final thing.
We only said that about half an hour
Ago. One final thing on this is associated with the membership classes for the synagogue, there is a session. If not a session, there's at least a recording, because I think it's more a recording, on the history of tefillah or mikveh. And I know it used to be available as a tape. I think it should still be available on the website or through us. So if you want a more complete discussion of this, one for which we were better, more prepared to have the conversation, then contact that. I don't remember whether we call it the tape on the, or the recording on the mikveh or a recording on baptism, but we have that somewhere in our files. Matt, are you aware of location of said recording? Okay. Over this next 2 weeks, Matt, if you could locate it, and then when we send out the next announcement about Stump the Stars, you can let people know, or we can let people know where it is or how they can get it. Cool. Thanks, Matt. Well,
We used up all our time. I had my watch on, so I'm looking at the computer screen.
all right. So thank you for your question, Jessica. Steve, when you get to hearing this, thank you for your question. Scott, thank you for talking about another Scott and filling in our Phoebe facts.
No, this is Junior.
No, he filled the Phoebe fact.
Oh, he's Phoebe facts.
Both. Yeah, he meant
Junior jargon.
Yes, thank you. Junior jargon and Phoebe facts.
Just throwing it out there.
So, any other questions before we close it up for tonight?
Oh, just to mention, I don't want to get into a discussion, I'm just mentioning. As of last time, we did not know where anybody could see The Chosen, that film series on the life of Yeshua. It turns out, crazy me, you don't have to search for it. It's on Amazon Prime. So whenever you want to watch it, in whatever order you want to watch those episodes in, it's on Amazon Prime. So that was a question I answered for myself, and I went, oh, I feel stupid now because I thought it was a secret hidden thing on YouTube, and it's on Amazon Prime.
And just so no one misunderstands what we said at the last session, we're not saying that The Chosen is a horrible.
No.
It's not a movie, it's series, I guess.
It's a miniseries, yeah.
Miniseries. It's actually a pretty good miniseries. We were simply reflecting on some things that were problematic, and in fact, in our day and age, can become even more problematic because of the astounding rise of anti-Semitism. And again, it's not that the series promotes it, it's just that some of the imagery left behind by the series can contribute to the problem.
In general, and I think I put this in a different way a couple of weeks ago, but I'm doubling down on it.
Yeah.
When you watch a movie or a TV series or a TV program or something that's filmed, and you watch a story that's filmed, your mind processes it differently than they do something like this, where we're talking. We just talk to each other. It's a conversation. But when you have pictures and music and a story that's been written and you're following it in a film manner, your mind will process it differently than it does a conversation in real life or reading a book or reading words on a page. Because it is using so many of your senses, everything except for smell, when you think about it. And smell-o-vision, it didn't work out. I think they did try smell-o-vision at one point for movies, and it didn't work. So we don't have that sense, which is a very powerful sense, by the way. But we do have all the other ones, and they are, well, okay, you could argue about touch, but your main other senses. And your mind interprets it differently and it remembers different things. So it doesn't necessarily remember dialogue between two characters, especially if you're dealing with something that has like 15 to 20 hours. You're not going to remember a conversation two people had. You might not, you won't remember characters' names, so you won't be able to identify who said what to whom. But you will remember the emotional impact it had on you. That's what you'll remember, the emotional impact it has on you. And you'll have impressions of the truth of the matter based on what you've seen, even if you can't identify why you feel that way or why you think you saw what you saw. And there are tons of articles on, especially movies, where people swear that this was in there and it was never on the screen. It was never even discussed, but people are sure that they saw that in that movie. To give you one example, if you saw Mel Gibson's version of The Passion, what is, looking back on it, because now, unless you saw it in the past couple of years, you haven't seen it for now 7, 8, 9 years. And you would poll the next 10 people that walked out, or next 100 people that walked out of Target. And did you see this movie? If they say yes, then you ask them further questions. What scene in this movie made the most impact with you? What do you think? I'm going to guess 7 out of 10 people say. Which scene made the most impact to them? The whipping. The whipping goes on and on and on and on. Up close and personal. Many body fluids are shown personally. When I went for the second time, because of the book research, I watched 4-year-olds who had been placed in the front row of the movie theater by their parents to be right up and close and personal, watching the whipping of Yeshua. Up close and personal. I was horrified. I was horrified. How on earth are they ever going to have an impression of a Yeshua who actually lived and cared and wants to have a relationship with them? I don't know how it's possible, humanly speaking, but I'm just saying that is not the main purpose of making a movie about Yeshua. I don't think it should be. Possibly part, but Mel Gibson, it was not anywhere in the realm of reality. Those ideas were all in his mind, that someone would spend that amount of time whipping a person during your average crucifixion back in those days. So that's what I'm saying. It's an emotional impression. It's not an intellectual impression that's left with people when they see most films, miniseries, or movies.
Yeah, it's,
So I just wanted to make that clear, because as the guy who was talking about the Passion Place in Oberammergau, I can't say that name. He said, we read the script and we corrected the script and we got every single thing seemed to be okay. And then we watched them put it on and we realized how much of the problem was not in the words of the script. How much of the problem with the communication of accuracy was in what they saw rather than what they heard.
the visual impact is what hits you hardest.
And your emotional sensory is very deep and it's very powerful. And it's the one that helps you remember, or causes you to remember when you don't want to remember. So sometimes it works against us.
Okay, cool. Thank you for remembering to say that.
Mhm.
Okay, again, and thank you all for joining us. And so we now bid you all farewell until some of you Tuesday, some of you Friday, and some of you
Whatever.
in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Although I know some of you are also there looking at us on Friday nights as well. So grateful to have you as part of that too. So thank you much. And so we say to you, Shavuot. Have a wonderful
Thank
week.
you for everything, guys.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Our privilege, thanks.
And it's so good to see both of you.
And your kitty.
It's great to see you guys.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she kept popping.
popping up in the back.